Welcome to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast, the podcast where we learn from cybersecurity experts how to stay safe, private, and secure on the cloud and in code. CSCP is hosted by Francesco Cipollone, your cybersecurity friend with a passion for all things cyber and sharing stories of other professionals with you. This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISO and security engineers act fast, prevent burnout, and implement DevSecOps at the speed of cloud. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast. My name is Francesco Cipollone. I'm your host today. And today we dive in a little bit on a side topic that we haven't talked in a while, that is fundamentally the executive view or the executive board, and a role that is kind of growing in board nowadays due to the maybe lack of experience in cybersecurity or confusion in what is a cybersecurity role and how much the board should know and should everybody be experienced. So the role is the CyberNet or non-executive director on cybersecurity. And today I have the pleasure and the honor to have Ollie Whitehouse with me that has had quite a career in cyber, has touched a lot of the organization and has done a lot of research from BlackBerry to Symantec to NCC Group more recently. But I'll let Ollie introduce itself. Ollie, thank you very much for coming on the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me, firstly. Yeah, so I've been very fortunate to have a career spanning over 25 years in cyber. So I started at the age of 17 during the dot-com boom, working out that we could make more money pen testing dot-com companies than building them. And the rest, as they say, is history. But no, joking aside, so I spent probably about 2/3 of my career in the services side, so in consultancy or managed services. And obviously, yes, 10.5 years at NCC Group most recently, but then obviously end user. So working very much as an applied individual in research and in helping secure technology soup to nuts. And I always joke now that I operate boardroom to binary, so I can still code and still use Ghidra, but I'm also equally comfortable discussing FTSE 100 strategy and challenging operational boards as to their governance.
Brilliant. And in your experience over the year, have you seen kind of the role change, or how did you start and how did you get to the point where you are today? If somebody wants to become a cybernet or get to the level where you are, you've been advising the government and you've been giving speech to the government about the cybersecurity strategy. So how does one get to that point from pure techie or from a pen tester? How does somebody grow into that role?
Yeah, and I think that there's no magic trick. Firstly, the second is I have a very kind of simple approach to life, and I'm inspired by a very cheesy movie from the 2000s called Pay It Forward. And the principle is if you just help people generally, you get invited into rooms. And I think what I recognized was in pen testing, it was an overly negative thing, right? You were finding faults and it wasn't, broadly speaking, helpful to a lot of the consumers of that information. And learning how to represent those findings in a way which is constructive, it invariably kind of allows you to make more or have more impact and make better progress. And so just take it from there. And over the years, just have helped lots of people. And they've ended up floating into very senior roles whilst learning around the mechanics of business. And again, going from that purist techie perspective of you must fix this, oh my God, lol, WTF, to understanding the kind of the realities of the challenges and the trade-offs that firms have to make around risk, and being able to adjust one's language to be able to operate in that environment, right? And so the kind of the edge that you have is you have this deep technical understanding of really how things really work, but actually you can wear a suit, get your hair cut, and operate in the business environment along with those peers that you need to ultimately influence and convince and control.
Great. No, thank you for that. And I think there is a good friction point, but a good chance right now in the industry where organization and cyber organization are getting more towards the business, but the other way around, the business right now have really the perception of cyber, even though might not have the experience, and hence the role of the cyber net. So what is a net, first of all, and what is a cyber net?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So often in kind of organizational governance, so in charities, they'll be known as trustees. In private corporations, they'll be known as non-execs. So effectively, they're directors and they're officers of the company who aren't operationally responsible for running it, but they are legally liable for it. And so they're there to service often the interests of three communities. So one is the external stakeholders, so investors would be a great example, customers, and then the employees, and they're effectively there to act as a governance function to hold the executive who are running the firm to make sure that it is being done so in a way which is appropriate and is well run. And obviously, then a cyber net comes in where you have a deeper understanding, maybe the most, because of the systemic nature of the risk, where you can come in and challenge the CISO or the CSO in a way which other more generalist non-execs may not be able to, because they don't have sufficient technical grounding or operational experience.
Right. And in that kind of role, do you end up building relationship with the CISO, or are you there as a scrutiny?
Well, it always has to be a relationship because, again, I think what you would recognize is, and it's true for a consultancy, if you go in and you are overly judgmental, aggressive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the shields are naturally going to go up. And again, no one is at fault here. No one does. Many people do not do things out of malice. So you need to build a relationship with the CISO, and that has to be built on trust. But then also, equally, there has to be transparency, because the CISO will be trying to achieve things, the firm will be trying to achieve things, and they've got to meet in the middle somewhere. And so, naturally, there's going to be a degree of independence in terms of the assessment and the reporting, but that doesn't need to be overly kind of aggressive or anything like that.
Right. And have you seen in your years and in the role a little bit of a distance and a challenge between, the executive committee or the CISO and the cyber net, or kind of a welcoming of, okay, finally we have somebody and align the board that help me getting my message across?
Yeah, and I think I think there's a spectrum that you would recognize there. So definitely, I think firstly, one of the interesting observations I would make is that CISOs are rarely on the executive committee discuss whether or not that's appropriate or not. They're often -1 or -2 in my experience from the executive committee, sometimes tucked away under the CFO or similar. And there's a question and a debate going on whether or not that continues to be appropriate for all the obvious reasons. I think some CISOs will see it as having an ally, having a net that really understands the problems and will leverage them. Others will be, naturally defensive. Don't check my homework. I'm taking care of everything. Don't kind of, don't come and cause any turbulence in my world. But often, when you bring the value that kind of a portfolio net often does, which is connecting them to others in the industry that can help them so they can learn from them, as well as them helping achieve what they also want in their own career, let alone having better and more restful nights. Those kind of initial, for where there is a little bit of, no, thank you, they often open up.
Right, and a restful night for a CISO, I think, is a rare thing to see.
Well, we have to aim for the moon, even if we only get to Watford.
Right, and for whoever is not listening and in London, Watford is just a little bit about outside, just on the outskirts of London.
Yeah, a terrible British colloquialism in terms of distance there. I do apologise. Yes.
After ancient feet, there is Watford.
That's right.
And Maybe on the flip side, on the both sides, what have you seen over the years? Have you seen a growth in terms of executive and understanding of cyber, and to which extent have they grown into that concept, or have we remained very superficial on everything is a risk, or maybe we see headlines, we jump on the headlines?
No, so I think low or love it. Ransomware has been a good thing because I think the impact that that is able to have, and the fact that there has been so much impact across all sectors, has meant that there is at least a greater understanding as to the potential, and then by virtue of that, it's driven greater engagement around crisis management. And so I think what we've seen is far more what we would refer to as gold team exercises. So actual simulations involving the executive and the non-executive on how we would actually deal with those incidents. In terms of understanding of the fundamentals is really superficial still, phishing, really residual human factors issues. But there's probably a point there, which is probably, do they need to know more than that? Well, not always, I think, in all cases, but they do need to understand what the risk is, who it's likely to be perpetrated by, likelihood, how it will manifest, and then ultimately how that risk can be in part transferred out. And so again, non-execs will have an understanding of what the insurance protection is of the organization and the fact that cyber insurance is a thing and policy cover. They will understand those things and can draw approximations. And so don't worry, they're not going to be running Metasploit anytime soon, but there's a far greater operational understanding of how cyber risk more generally manifests, and where the kind of the choke points are, things like supply chain, mergers and acquisitions, key supply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So there is still an.
This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Phoenix platform connects to your repositories, scanners, and cloud, correlates all the information, and provides you with a prioritized list of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed first. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISOs and developers remove friction and maximize the use of DevSecOps professionals at phoenix.security. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click.
Understanding, or a better understanding from a risk perspective, rather than, of course, the technicality of how to conduct a phishing attempt, or do I need to run a pen test? But maybe they know what a pen test is.
They do know what a pen test is, and increasingly, and I think we have regulation to thank for this, increasingly can consume red team reporting, because again, if you look in UK sectors and wider European, as well as Australian and Singaporean now, financial services all now have regulatory mandated red teaming. In the UK, we obviously have telecommunications, civil nuclear, civil aviation. There's other sectors again similarly. So again, they will understand that. They will understand, broadly speaking, Russian, Chinese intent, organized crime intent and capability. And so, I would say net positive, right?
Okay, no, that's great. And I think you touch on a good point, that is the role of regulation. And I think I wanted to take probably this chance to also plug in the quite strong stance the US have taken in the role of regulation, and your view and opinion on where the UK government and the European instance have taken. Like Germany has driven a lot on critical national infrastructure. Maybe the UK is pushing for it, but it's lagging a little bit behind, while the US is really taking a strong stance on software supply chain. So where do you see us going as an industry in the UK and Europe?
Yeah, so I think, if we look at where the UK has got to, we do have the Telecom Security Act now, which is enshrined in law, which has some really robust mandated technical security requirements for CNI telco providers. I think, what you will recognize is that governments, I think, in the round have recognized that there's going to have to be increasing regulation in order to make sure that the free market does what it should. Because the free market left its own devices, we're all focused, broadly speaking, on growth and profitability. Cyber is, broadly speaking, a cost, and so it potentially reduces agility, so limits growth, and or kind of rips some of the profit out. I think we are seeing with GDPR2 and NIS2 and similar, we are seeing increasing recognition that as the threat adapts and as technology becomes ever more pervasive, we will need more debate, right? Software bill of materials, is that where we should, the US should have laid its bets? Will it yield? Probably not in the way that they want it to. But it is a sign. I think what that does signal, more importantly, is the US has historically been very reticent to do any type of regulation around cyber. And Colonial Pipeline and other big events like that, and obviously SolarWinds, were a big wake-up call for them. And now they've kind of joined the party. They are one of the largest markets on the planet, right? So any regulation that they set has a net positive benefit for global security, one would argue.
Right. And I think there is a lot of debate around the original intent of SBOM that was maybe software bill of material that end up being, a regulation thing. So where there is a regulation, there is evolution of the regulation and interpretation of the regulation, I think.
Well, I agree. I'm not so. I think SBOMs they solve a thing. I'm not sure I can quantify its value in the cyber sense. Unless we have another log4j and it allows us to be able to do the database query to identify all the instances of a particular log4j library. I'm not sure that software bill of materials would have mitigated SolarWinds. I'm not sure it would have mitigated a load of other threats, right? And so, but they've gone down this particular road, and kudos to them. They'll make it work, right? But they'll have better data than anyone by virtue of this. So we'll all be proven wrong at some point, I'm sure.
Can you use that data actually? Is that data available to anything other than, I need to produce a SBOM, I need to regulate it, and then there is the vulnerability exchange that now is growing as a source of regulation. But fundamentally, there is a lot of information out there that is uncollided with each other. So asset management, back to asset management problem in the whole original space. And I think that's where the SBOM originally wanted to go as the first push to actually software asset management.
And I agree, but at the moment there is information advantage within certain companies, SBOMs and that being distributed erodes that, right? And there will be some bright sparks who's smarter than any of us that will work out a way to leverage that data for net positive. And so I'm a big fan of structured data, which is available and open to support security endeavors. Because I think we've recognized that that's often been the hindrance in a lot of cases of having sufficiently large data sets.
Yeah, but then on the other side is, as a business, how do I consume that large amount of data that is out there, or do I even consume it? So what is, as you said, what is the net positive of all that data?
Well, and as we know, there'll be a plethora of new startups that are consuming that data and working out how to extract a signal for you, dear end user megacorp, who will then buy that rather than doing all that processing and analysis yourself. And again, whether or not that will be a Nessus like kind of Tenable type firm, or will it be down at a lower kind of will there be native integrations with Sentinel or similar discussed?
Brilliant. And on that subject, has that conversation kind of steered boards, in your opinion, on more software supply chain and software risk? Because there's always been kind of an undercutting or underrepresented element, or board maybe in CISO understand more network and infrastructure and pen testing because of the regulation, but software is really new. And we've seen more software attacks, software supply chain attacks. So has the board kind of perceived that now there is another player in the supply chain issues?
No, I think, if I look at the quality of conversations that often occur still, so there's no differentiation at board level often between software supplier and supplier. So
Mhm.
it'll all be wrapped up in the generics of the supply chain. There's that big amorphous mass over there that's terrifying, and we can't control it, and we don't have entirely contractual cover. Most of the conversations that I've been party to at board level still revolve around asset management, level of vulnerability in an estate. I would say arguably earlier stage hygiene aspects of cyber rather than the next wave of super controls that will allow us to go. I think you speak to any organization of any reasonable size and of any reasonable age, and they still, ask them to quantify how much of their estate is under management, what percentage of that estate is actually actively patched, within what
Mhm.
time frame, where don't they have multi-factor authentication, and you end up kind of going round the loop on that still in 2023, which is relatively terrifying.
But and you touch point on the level of quality of conversation around vulnerabilities, risk. So what is more prominent at the board level? Are they getting into the nitty gritty of like, oh, how many vulnerabilities do we have, or do they even understand that concept, or they want more risk-based kind of qualitative information?
Yeah, so I think it's more risk-based discussions, but one of the indicators often is, one of the things that can be metricators as a dashboard is how many vulnerabilities do we have and what's the burn
Right.
rate down on those and those types of things. But often, the meat of the discussion centers around, can insert adversary that, of worst nightmares do this to us after they read the headline of it happening to someone else last week? And then, what are the controls that we have in place which mean that wouldn't happen to us or would reduce the likelihood, or it's those types of conversations that are more so had, but it is often driven by headlines. It's,
Mhm.
I sat on a board and this happened here. I read that this happened last week to this organization. The regulator has issued this, those types of things is often what ends up driving those kind of monthly or bi-monthly discussions.
So it's very reactive to the headline of the Log4j or the SolarWind attack or the other thing that could happen. And then
Yeah,
are we going to be the next Uber? Are we going to be the next,
exactly.
I don't know,
Twitter at the
Rackspace?
moment. Yeah, exactly. All of that, and then coupled with, and then often you can kind of steer those conversations, which is, but what if we are, right? And then,
Mhm.
would we be willing to pay the ransom if we had to? And that it's becoming quite a rich conversation actually, because that's where directors feel like they can add some value, if that makes
Right.
sense, to those types of conversations because of all the complexities.
And as a CISO, how do you suggest and recommend to CISO practitioner that kind of had that interaction with the board to actually steer the conversation in that positive terms? So instead of being reactive and say, no, is everything under control? We're never going to be that, into more, yes, that's a possibility. We need to be cyber resilient. Because that's, I think, in 2022, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And are you prepared for it? So are you cyber resilient, and what are you going to do? How are you going to prepare it, and what are you going to do? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think you're bang on with that. It is very much taking the board on a journey, which is, we're going to have security incidents, and again, any organization of any size with any complexity is naturally going to have incidents. The role of the CISO is to not don their underwear on the outside and stop the organization from having. What it is to allow the blast radius of those incidents to be contained sufficiently and to not be material to the firm. But then giving a sense of likelihood, cadence, and impact of those incidents, and that could be based on one's own experience within the organization, as well as kind of more thematic points from the industry as a whole, both geographically and internationally. I think is very important. And I think, for the practitioner CISO, the thing to think about is, again, non-execs and arguably seniors inside firms, they like to feel clever to a certain extent, and they do have a wealth of experience, and so don't always present everything as being fine. present them with challenges which you are seeking their input and counsel on, and that will just build a deeper set of kind of collaborative relationships more generally, and they will have experience and insight on things which you don't, and suck it up, right? You know, it's a great thing. But more generally, I think, you know, we are going to get boards increasingly. We are seeing a generational shift now in their technological understanding, and I think that's a net positive, because I think, you know, even if you rewind even 5 years ago, boards really didn't understand, they weren't immersive, right? And in the UK, we've just gone through a prime ministerial change, and arguably our current prime minister is the first one that really, you know, has grown up immersed in technology in the same way. So they can expect more challenge and a deeper level of interest and willingness to engage, and working out how they're going to contend with that and interact with that is probably a good new life skill to develop if they haven't already.
Interesting. And I think I was having this conversation a couple of podcasts ago on the fact that there is almost like a perception of even what an asset means or what something means, depending of your age or where you were born fundamentally. And we had a generation of people coming from traditional infrastructure or traditional patching and server admin. Then you had a generation of maybe software development, then cloud, and now we're going back to software development and kind of a hybrid. So we're expecting the next wave of executive to be much more tech aware, or
yes,
are we already there?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a whole wave of executives that are deeply familiar with what digital transformation looks like, and actually understands what that means in practice. You know, I'm very fortunate in that I see into an awful lot of organizations of different types, and I can look inside local government, central government, and the private sector, and it's there now, right? They've seen those big programs that have stuck and failed. They've understood the terminology. They understand what cloud is. And again, driven by the headlines, but, you know, people are going to ask automation, you know, RPA, machine learning, all of these things, they will be challenging because the productivity gains for the firm, or perceived productivity gains, you're going to see this more so. And again, you know, I think if I rewind back to my prior role, if I looked at the next generation of non-execs that came in, you know, there was a higher representation of those who are deep science and technology background than had ever occurred previously. Because historically financial, right, is where non-execs came from. And I think we're seeing an S&T generation start to come through.
No, that's interesting. And on that topic, actually, when do you advise an organization or somebody else that is ready for a non-exec?
Well, and I think, you know, sometimes it's mandated, right? If you're certain, you have to. But I think it's when they get to a level of maturity where they want to show good governance. And it's a bit like, when do you install your first CISO? When do you install your first second line function? When you break that operational and then governance piece, you know, non-execs, I think, are similar. And again, you know, I've seen them be introduced for companies generating 15 million, obviously, you know, in revenue, which is tiny by comparison, up all the way through that spectrum. It's often led by the managing director, chief exec, and their own aspirations, really, coupled with how regulated or what their customers are asking for, some other kind of market forcing functions.
So it's really a function to audit, to have an external eye on the company, but also an external helper and something, a diligence role.
Yes, and so my first non-exec role was exactly that. Like the managing director at the time wanted to, had a great team under him, but wanted to basically bring in a bunch of discrete peers with different skills. So he brought me in as a technologist. He brought in someone with a finance background, someone with a great HR background, someone with a great commercial background. And all we did was we brought that experience to help the business evolve and kind of accelerate its growth almost. And again, that's why it's very much tied often to managing director or owner ambition outside of where it's mandated.
Right. And maybe on the other topic that is maybe more familiar to us or some other people that have been working in startup, Have you seen a wave of maybe non-exec that are more hands-on on early stage startup, or investors that's taken that role?
So, funnily enough, I had a call earlier this afternoon in UK time with a venture capitalist, and I think they're the ones that drive that, if I'm being honest. So the conversations I have with private equity and VC are more likely to inject some of that talent from a non-exec perspective into a startup, where as part of a seed or a Series A activity. Where they feel that the management team would benefit from some external coaching and advice and support. And so I think, maybe that's sometimes the benefit of taking external investment rather than trying to grow organically. But I think, and again, there's often a propensity for, I would say, our US venture capitalists to be a little bit more involved than the slightly more conservative European venture capitalists, who are a bit more, here's my money, here's my money, but then I'm just going to leave you to run your business and maybe sit as a traditional non-exec. Whereas I think the US want to de-risk as much as possible their investment and give the organization the best chance of succeeding. And so we'll lavish it with a love bomb of talent in various shades of non-execness.
Brilliant. And how can, and which kind of organization can really benefit from a cybernet? You've seen technology-driven organizations that never had a CISO, or what kind of organization actually really benefit in terms of startup?
And I think it really is it's a broad spectrum. So I would joke often it's the larger organizations that have the more traditional boards that benefit the most, right? Because they're often really highly regulated, and or there's an expectation that it's all naturally fine, yet they often carry the largest amounts of technical debt for all the reasons that we would understand, but often struggle to get true independence at the board level. I think actually startups, interestingly, they carry very little operational debt often. They're cloud first, they understand what infrastructure as code is, all of these things, and are benefiting from modern design patterns. And often for them, it is just it's almost just helping them when to introduce certain controls which are appropriate to their risk, as well as their stage of funding and revenue. So they don't overcompensate too early, because again, as you know, as a startup, you should be carrying a healthy level of technical debt and risk, because you're never quite sure the firm's going to make it, right? And so it's often helping set that barometer almost on the risk profile at that stage. But it's a lot less involved. It's often most valuable, very large, complex, 20-year-old organizations that benefit from cybernets the most, because there's just a lot of dragons in there.
Right, and probably they don't know what cyber means, or that they need a little bit of education, and then maybe not technology aware, but they understand risk.
They understand risk, but again, point to me another systemic risk that pretty much every organization faces. Right, there isn't many really that affect every organization of every type in every sector, in every geography. One may say, GDPR, but again, roots in cyber, health and safety for sure, but it's rare that all of your staff are going to die overnight, where actually the cyber equivalent is the organization's entire systems can be lost in one fell swoop. And so, yes, they do understand risk, but again, as quantification in cyber risk is still, even with FAIR, is still quite embryonic, and is not well practiced in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, there is still, as you rightfully say, a lot of reliance on how many vulnerabilities you have, how quickly are you fixing, and that's about it.
I always draw analogies between cyber and 1800s medicine, right? We've got a lot of quackery opinion at the moment, and not a lot of first principle science still. So, a lot of the controls that we have, even, we don't know when they work, against which threats, with what caveats, because we don't actually have the evidence bases which support them. A lot of them seem logically sound to do at a time. Yeah, the best work, one of the great worked examples is passwords. So we used to have passwords that had to be gazillion characters long, with be totally immemorable, changed every 30 days. But no one actually had done the science and the research to show that humans could remember about 4 of them before they started to write them down because of those complexity requirements, right? And so, but our industry and our controls frameworks are littered with these things. So we're doing things because probably they are good, but we don't know how good in reality.
Right.
And that's the journey we get to go on. And that's why the industry is so fascinating.
No, it is. And I think you brought in an interesting topic, that is, how do you quantify the net effect or the net value of a control or a non-control? And I think that's a maturity of the risk, or cyber risk quantification, that is so immature. And I think it's mostly nowadays gut feeling, as you mentioned, rightfully fair, is the first attempt to actually introduce a monetary and non-monetary value, and kind of a probability of exploitation and an impact analysis into the field that is completely absent. Right now is like, either you have it or you don't. You don't have any concept of probability. I think it's the base of risk.
Exactly right. And this is the terrifying thing, and this is where things like FAIR and others are, a net positives, I think. But again, it's handfuls of people around the globe that do that well, right? But you can see the shoots almost that it's going to start to take off, and arguably that in part is going to be driven by cyber insurance and the losses that they have seen because they've written such poor book. Is going to drive better actuarial and thus risk understanding more generally against what risks are mitigated with what controls, because those evidence bases will be built.
Right. And the kind of the evidence and the maturity of the industry will be driven by what is not going to be insured or what will be insured.
That's right. And people are feeling the pain now, right? That they previously got insurance and it's not being offered now because they've not actually dealt with in the intervening 12 months certain risks that were previously identified. And I think that will be a trend that will continue more broadly. And we know, there's a next generation of cyber insurer that's coming. We know of one that's already able to write a book which is about 25% better than most others, and they mandate things like continual scanning and those types of things, as well as remediation and similar.
So are you, in your opinion, do you see organizations that are able to demonstrate their risk profile or argument against a model that insurance have to be better off because they can reduce their premium? Or are you seeing organizations going down that path, especially on the financial, where they have quant people?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think people are just grateful they can get insurance at the moment, if I'm being honest. I don't think anyone is as bold as being able to. I think being able to get the level of cover is often the trick now that the organizations are wrestling with, and there are certain organizations are able to evidence that. And again, what I will observe is some of the next generation financial services organizations are pretty slick operations. And it was an interesting point you made earlier. Every company is a technology company now, right? And those that have come without the past are often far better placed because they've learned the Netflix models of separating kind of compliance costs with cloud architecture patterns and those types of things, and they can just give the warm fuzzies because it's quite clear and evidence they know what they've got. It's well controlled and governed. It's all happening through CI/CD pipelines, and it isn't reliant on human processes in a low-cost-based country that is inherently fragile, which is what some of the older organizations may be relying on.
Right, and maybe less supply chain issue or potential issue.
Exactly. Although I don't know, like Circle CI this week, how many organizations have been carefully mopping up and by having to roll all of those all of those secrets and keys everywhere because of that supply chain breach, right? Which is pretty material, right? We saw Slack, Okta, all secondary victims because of that.
Yeah, and I think on that point, we start seeing a pattern, I guess, on the recent years. So is that pattern driven by the fact that we've gone so well at patching and identifying issues? So it's much easier to actually inject a line of code in a library that is maintained by an open source, or is that a vector of attack that is kind of at the grab of attacker nowadays? What do you think?
Well, I just think that there's more attackers trying more things. I really do. I think if you look at, we also had the PY Torch breach last week, was it, or just before New Year, which turned out that was a bug bounty that went awry. But there were 4 days where PY Torch, which was a machine learning library, had basically a reconnaissance implant in it. So we just got more people pushing on more of the boundaries that we've got, and I think by virtue of that, I think it's ensuring the inherent fragility of it all. And so I think, yes, for some it'll be more tactical. So again, what we saw with the Chinese state, they did understand that the supply chain was weaker, and you could breach one organization and gain access to many. So great ROI from them. Similarly, then Russia with SolarWinds. I think for others, there is just more organized criminal activity. There's initial access brokers. Like, who knew there was ever going to be a whole supply chain in the criminal fraternity? And then one of that components being just the initial access brokers, right? And so naturally, we're seeing now, I read reporting this week, which saw one framework exploiting 30 WordPress vulnerabilities just being sprayed everywhere just to see where they get in, right? So I think it's just the new world. It's the tempo, it's the scale, it's the ferocity. It's just gone up a level, and so we see more of it all over.
And I think you brought a point that there is the whole attacker industry. There is the 2 levels, that is nation state and non-nation state, but all of them are getting better at automating because they are digitally native. So there is a lot of occasional and very targeted one, but there is a lot of spray and pray and see where it hits.
Yeah, and we saw Rackspace having to migrate how many customers off of their hosted Exchange environment, which was effectively a ransomware operation using a 0-day in Outlook Web Access. Come on, this is it's a new world, right? Granted, it was only a subversion on a mitigation, but that was a big company that felt some pain, and it is quite clear, and we do see it. About 18 months ago, I remember there was a case where there was organized crime targeting a 0-day and a VPN device, and ended up doing the research to find out what the underlying vulnerability was because the vendor couldn't. But this is the world where we've just got small clutches of criminals who are able to develop new capability and then use it at internet scale quite quickly, and it keeps us on our toes, right?
Yeah, and I think the automation part is what is mostly interesting, because it's pushing the boundary of the industry to actually react in an automated way, and then maybe focus on the controls that are maybe more sophisticated. That is, like, how do you chain 3 or 4 or 5 attacks? That is, you can't really automate that kind of level of insight. So maybe the industry.
But here's a great question, right? And I think what we're starting, and you're right. What I don't think we have seen the defense community automate the containment and the response at the same pace that the aggressors have automated the intrusions. If I look at a lot of organizations, they're increasingly automating the detection, sure, but actually, when you detect a breach, why are you not containing that device? And containment can be a spectrum again. It can be total isolation. It can be restricting bandwidth down, so it's a trickle, right? There's a spectrum of response, and I just don't think the blue teams necessarily have embraced that level, and because they're too concerned about causing business interruption. When on the other end of that, you let that run, and you don't catch it in time, the business interruption becomes far greater anyway.
Right, and I think there is the role of the cybernet is to bring kind of those trickle point in the board and saying, okay, how to ensure, how to maybe do something about it, but it's still gonna kill you or not.
Yes, that's right. And one of the challenges that I gave one, which was, it's not about having 0 or 1 incident, right? We're going to have the incidents. It's about mean time to detection, mean time to containment, and mean time to recovery, right? That's the
Hmm.
performance metrics we care about. And really, let alone then, what the impact overarchingly was. And when they're explaining that, they get it, right?
Right.
We shouldn't trying to be aiming for 0 risk, but with the events that we do have, we should be able to detect them quickly. We should be able to contain them quickly, recover, and then also, the actual manifest impact on the organization should be minimized as possible. And that drives a different type of performance discussion than did we have any incidents this week? Well, yes, we
Well,
did.
it's more data driven, and I think it's the maturity around the data rather than yes, no. It's more nuanced than yes, no, and it enable an executive to tell a better story of yes, we are remediating, we're fixing things at this rate, is reducing this part of risk, or even better, is reducing our total potential or direct and indirect exposure to this level. And then we can contain in X number of days because we run an exercise. That's a very powerful answer of a CISO.
That's right. And I think one for practitioner CISOs, a great conversation to have with the board and the exec is who do you want us to be able to protect against? And you give them a spectrum of attackers and capability. Because everyone, they often start to everyone. Okay, so you want to protect against the full capabilities of insert terrifying threat actor and their hundreds of millions of dollars of budgets. Well, no, we don't want to protect it against those. Okay, and you can actually end up having quite an informed discussion where it ends up getting to, well, we just don't want to be embarrassed. So if someone actually does breach us and it is bad, that they are of sufficient caliber and quality and that we've got the basics right, but that is, and I've sat in some very large organizations that have said, we want to be impervious to everyone. And then you go, do you understand what that will cost? And then they very, quickly change their perspective where they don't want to do that.
Right. And I think that's a very useful conversation. But this conversation has been brilliant. And as we coming to a close, we don't want to live on a doom and gloom. And we have a tradition on the podcast to live on a positive note. So in your years of experience and view, what do you see us getting better, or do you see the industry as getting better? Or what is your positive closing note, if you want?
Yeah, so I think I'll leave 3 things for the listeners. One is the industry is more diverse than it ever has been. And I mean that across every characteristic and type. And so by virtue of that, we have got more voices with fresher ideas, with a more kind of holistic set of views involved. So that is a net positive. The second is we do understand more than we ever have done around the problem, and we will continue to do so. And again, I think you look at some of the next generation computing architectures and programming languages and a lot of the vulnerability classes that they mitigate at the lowest levels. And again, that is a net positive. And I think, thirdly, we're going to win, right? What shape, size, color, and when is to be debated. But ultimately, the world will incrementally improve with each month that goes past as everyone contributes. And again, we see that, techniques that did work 5 years ago do not work now. And so just kind of keep the faith, right? And keep pushing. And it may feel kind of dark and gloomy, but there's no need to be, right? It's going to be a lot of fun and it's going to end up on a high.
No, that's brilliant. And I think we got better at patching and fixing stuff and putting firewall in, and those have become kind of the norm. But it wasn't like that 5 years ago.
Well, and I would say that, a couple of things, right? So Amazon in April, all S3 buckets now will be locked down by default.
Right.
We're seeing these large, like hyperscaler moves now, which clicks everyone overnight to a better world. And it's just going to be more of it. So loads of reason for optimism.
Fantastic. And Ollie, if somebody want to listen more about you, what you talk about, I know you have a blog, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can write a Substack every week, which goes out, which summarizes weekly intelligence and the world of this is going on, and that's bluepurple.substack.com. I don't do a podcast. I leave that to talented people like yourself. But you can read my writing every week.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ollie. It's been an absolute pleasure. And everybody, get out there, talk about risk. And it's a world that is getting better every day, but it's a journey. So you need to get everybody off your board together. And if you're sizable enough, maybe think about a cybernet, because it can be your ally. Thank you very much, Ollie.
Thank you.
And everybody, stay safe. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and post it on social media tagging Cybersecurity Cloud Podcast for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Discover other episodes at www.cybersecuritypodcast.com.